Exclusive tutorials, study sheets, and storyboards are available on my Patreon.
I'm Kai, an anime manga artist from the UK. Today I want to go over 5 things that I consider to be the fundamentals of making manga. As far as I know, there isn't a actual fundamentals for how to draw manga, but this is what I consider to be important. Let's get into it. First, I think composition is definitely an important one. This is, of course, whatever's going inside your panels or squares when you draw them. This is a huge part of what makes your manga interesting because the shots and compositions you choose will affect how the story is portrayed. What can be super important to creating a good, interesting composition is using the rule of thirds. And you can find this in a lot of different composition tutorials that you might look at, like David Finch's one. It's kind of like a golden ratio where you draw 2 vertical lines and 2 horizontal lines, and where those lines intersect is where important information is going to go. And as you can see here, I'm kind of following that with the example that I'm drawing here, and on top of that, bubbles also follow the rule of thirds, so you want to put your bubbles on the focal points too, typically. Of course, this is not always going to be the case, but I think it is a way to simplify it so that you can fit everything inside of the composition and inside of the panel that you're drawing. It's a very versatile method, so you can use it in a lot of different scenarios and sort of panels that you're doing. And I also use foreground characters to sort of frame a shot, so when you put something in the foreground, it actually adds a lot more, depth to the character in the background, because the character in the foreground is seen as, one big shape, and it sort of draws attention to the character in the background. You can sort of bring more attention to the main character, which is usually the character that I'm drawing in pink. On top of that, like you see here, you can also use objects to frame the shot, not just people. And I thought it would be easier to lay out in simple colors too, so that you could see the different parts of a composition and what makes up a scene. In red you'd have the foreground, in pink you'd have the main characters, or the midgrounds, and in blue you'd have the background. And if you decide to frame your own shots like this, I feel like you'll be thinking in the parts, so you'll always have a more interesting composition than if you were just going to do it freehand. Of course, it's very rare that I color my characters when I'm actually doing storyboards, but I'm definitely thinking in foreground, midground, background when I'm creating each scene, and it does make the scene have a lot more depth, rather than being a super flat scene. And I'm sure you can see how using some of these simple elements can really make your shots more interesting if you're following the rule of thirds and you're using sort of foreground things to frame a shot. I feel like you'll always have sort of an interesting composition. You can also use sort of values to guide a reader's eye, but I'll talk about that a bit later when I talk about contrast. And as you can see here, I'm drawing a few buildings. Usually you use this kind of shot for, to end a scene, or in some cases to be an establishing shot. I'm going to cover paneling, but let me cover the super basics first, which you've heard from every tutorial already, which is how your eyes travel in a zigzag pattern when you're reading. Usually you have 1 to 5 panels on a page, and sometimes you have 6 panels too, but going over that is typically not where you want to be in terms of what you're drawing on your page, because it makes everything super crammed. And naturally we use panels to determine the pacing, so bigger panels people are going to spend a long time on, and smaller panels they're going to just gloss over. So let me run over some mistakes real quick. So first of all, I think a common mistake is sort of boring paneling, which is super symmetrical, which is typically not really what you want to do unless you have a reason to. In addition, drawing too many head shots or eye shots, or even too many foot shots sometimes, can make your stuff very boring to read, and it's just not interesting for people who want to get into it. Rather, you want to choose a side and sort of make your pages through that, and you want to vary your shots enough that when people read it, they get some kind of interest from it. You want to start with establishing shots, or put some kind of establishing shot in there so that people know where the characters are, and that will make your stuff a lot more believable, and it will make it a lot more interesting too, because you're using a lot of different shots. As you can see here, I'm using a lot of different techniques to sort of make the page more interesting than it was previously. Not that you can't use idle headshots, you definitely can, but it depends how many you're using and how often you're using them. Next, I want to go over some things that can make your pages a lot more interesting. First, I want to go over, overlap, which is, overlapping your characters over pages, which can make a page super interesting, and you don't really need a reason to do this. I think a lot of people use them for character introductions, but you can also use them for just if a character's talking and you want to add some interest to the page. And here you can see I'm overlapping panels, and this can get super complicated quickly if, you're not used to doing it, but it can make a page a lot more interesting. Just figuring out these super simple ways to make your pages more interesting can add a lot more interest to each individual page as readers keep reading it, and it won't feel as sort of similar to the last page. Next, I want to go over contrast, which I also consider to be a fundamental. I guess this is also value if you want, but to improve in this, I usually do these free value studies, which is sort of like, you know, getting a reference and picking free values, which is black, white, and 50% gray. And then after that, I'll break down the scene into super basic, you know, shapes and values in general. And this can really help if you're getting into drawing manga, and it teaches you how to guide the reader's eye with sort of, you know, different shades. On top of that, it also shows you how much black, grey and white you can use in a page. For example, you wouldn't want to overpower the page with black unless you're trying to create some kind of, you know, ominous vibe, and you wouldn't want to sort of make the whole page white unless you had a reason for that. And I think figuring out how to do this is very helpful for when you're actually creating manga. Even with comics, I feel like they do this a lot too. On top of that, I think these studies really help with, you know, deciding your shots too. You can gain a lot from this when you're sort of trying to learn composition. Even a lot of these things that you can find, a lot of the, you know, movie references that you might be breaking down, they, you know, follow the rule of thirds too, and it can help a lot when you have this in mind when you're breaking down these kinds of scenes. As you can see here, I'm starting with a super dark one, and I'm sort of starting with black and, you know, making stuff based off that. Essentially, you can start with different bases and see what you come up with. But generally, I think this can really help you with your contrast and things like that. If your pages feel super flat, I feel like this can really be a study that can help you a lot, because it's going to teach you how much space a single object can take up and what that contrast might be. After that, I want to cover how contrast might look on a page. So here's some examples of what a lot of people do, especially when they're coming from an illustrated background. They actually sort of shade pages or shade things on pages like they're drawing an illustration with a lot of shading and sort of blending and things like that. And a lot of mangas just aren't like that. In fact, the majority of mangas aren't like that. There are very few exceptions, I'm sure, but, you know, typically a lot of the times there's a lot of black in a manga page. So here's some examples of more interesting sort of things that you could use. And this isn't to say to make your whole page half black or something like that, but more so to sort of follow the basics of making enough black in your page and making enough gray in your page that mimics the basic feeling of this one. And if you don't want to use a lot of black in your pages, then I think there's a lot of ways that shoujo mangas approach using a lot of grays, and I think you should do a lot of studies of those as opposed to sort of trying to shade a manga page. And once you figure out how shonen mangas approach it, I think it will be a lot easier for you. Next, I want to cover inking. Since I've covered this in another video, I'm just gonna go over it very quickly. Typically, there's a lot of different ways to approach inking. Sometimes you use thicker outlines and thinner insides. Other times, you know, you can approach it and not use any line variation at all. I think the most common is to use line variation on the outside and then use sort of thinner details on the inside of a page. But you'll have to look at different types of manga pages and see what you like and find out how they do it and implement that into your own stuff. There are a lot of cool things that you can mimic when you're drawing, you know, with inks. And since inks is the super primary thing when it comes to drawing manga, if you really think about it, when mangakas are drawing on paper, or how it used to be when they were drawing on paper, the majority of everything was just ink, and that's basically it. Sometimes there was absolutely no screen tone whatsoever on a page, and I think it's cool to keep in mind that a lot of mangas are, you know, plain black and plain white, and you should really make sure that your pages work like that before you start putting in screen tone and things like that, in my opinion. Side note, but if you use a monochrome layer when you're sort of drawing your pages, you can make your lines a lot more sharp, simply because monochrome layers only recognize black and white. You see, with a color layer, it recognizes all the grays in between black and white, so you end up with a line that's a lot more blurry. You should give it a try. And here I'm showing a lot of different methods for approaching how to ink. And generally you do want to put a lot of time into your inking, since it's going to be one of the most important things, because there's going to be a lot of things that, you know, readers are going to see. And while you're inking, you also want to keep a sort of eye on how much contrast you're putting down in terms of how much black and things like that. I think these kinds of things can be super important, as I talked about earlier with contrast. However, that depends on the kind of style you're trying to go for and what you're trying to sort of convey, I feel like. I haven't covered screen tones, but even though I do think these could be considered fundamental, I guess I would consider them already covered during contrast and things like that. But that's it for inking. Since the video's basically finished now, I wanted to cover something that couldn't be a fundamental because it's so small, but it's such a big deal when you're making your mangas, and that's keeping sort of characters consistent in terms of their expression and the way you're drawing them, like how they move and things like that. You wouldn't want to pose a shy character in a way that makes them seem confident, because they're just not that kind of character. If you do this, it can really break sort of the immersion of the, people who are reading it, and I feel like not a lot of people consider this, even though it's a pretty big deal, and it can make your manga feel a lot more believable if characters are consistent in terms of their expression. It would be kind of weird if a shy character was making an expression they wouldn't normally make and there was no explanation for it at all. But yeah, that's it from me. If you liked the video, like and subscribe. Peace out.